it's really interesting. I think actually there's a lot of similarities. Some differences, but a lot of similarities between some aspects of sort of Western Christian thought and some aspects of all of the Indian religious traditions, and especially what you're saying about sort of separation of families is, I think that's nailed on actually, and that's part of the problem for sure. It is weirdly individualistic in the UK now, where you take elementary knowledge and that is sublated with knowledge that is superior to it. So it's okay for now. At the next step, you'll sublate that with superior knowledge, then superior knowledge, then superior knowledge. And of course the end product for the Indian religious traditions would be liberation.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Jay Thakkar Show. Today we have Dr. Gary Donnelly. He is an expert in Indian philosophy and particularly he has done a lot of work in Buddhism. His journey is pretty interesting. He studied Indian philosophy and he taught Indian philosophy in different universities, and now he's currently in economics department in the University of Manchester.
Yes.
So thank you so much for giving us the time.
No, thank you. It's good to be here.
So, dealing with Indian philosophy and teaching Indian philosophy usually deals extensively with nature of self,
yes,
and reality, and these sort of terms, especially suffering as well.
Yes.
When it comes to Buddhism, so how do you introduce these concepts to Western audience?
It's a good question, and it's sometimes I think students are initially put off because they see Sanskrit words. They're not familiar with just the terminology, and that can be really off-putting. So I think the first thing, or my first approach has always been to try and demystify that and make it normal. I think actually there are analogues in Western thought to things like the Atman, things like the Brahman. So it might be a little anachronistic, but if we can talk about the Atman, at least initially with students, in the form of a soul, they're all familiar with this, something that persists after you die, something that you would say is the essential feature that is you, minus all your physical features and your personality, something that you whittle down, an ultimate principle. I think if we can do that, at least in the first instance, students sort of get a quick grip on what it is, the direction that we're going to take and what it is that we're going to be talking about. Similarly with the Brahman, I think the major difference that students, in my experience, have struggled to get to grips with is they have a concept of God or Godhead already. You know, most in the UK brought up at least around Christianity, if not explicitly in Christian schools and stuff. I was in Christian schools till I was 18. So they have a notion of what the Godhead might be. But the problem is that they associate this with sort of personhood. So God the Father, a God who intervenes, a God who acts, a God who makes judgments, a God who can be angered, a God who can be pleased. And the major difference when you're talking about the Brahman, especially in relation to things like Advaita, is that the Brahman does none of these things, right? So ultimately we're going to say the Brahman doesn't act, it doesn't feel, it can't be pleased, it doesn't get angry, it doesn't do these person things that God does in the West. Nevertheless, we can use that as a sort of sidestep in. So when we talk about the Brahman, the ultimate principle, the cosmic force, the macrocosm to your microcosmic soul, super soul, cosmic soul, you know, and it gets put in all sorts of different ways. Once they have a grip with that, which they will get pretty quickly, I think, you can start to talk about, well, now we know broadly what we're speaking about, let's whittle it down. Does this thing have attributes? If it did, what would that mean? Can it act? How did it create? Why is it created? Why is it worth our while getting back to this? Why do we want to realise the Brahman? Why have so many religious traditions spent thousands of years sort of directing us on different ways to do that? And that's where the sort of fun is for me with students. I think then they understand, or they start to understand why people want to get to this point, and they start to think about not just the positives, but also the sort of negatives or the problems with some of the philosophy. So Brahman with features, Brahman without features. Someone like Shankara would use both, right? He said, well, for the entry level, we'll talk about the Brahman with attributes, or this is useful because it gives you an idea in your mind. As your spiritual practice becomes more developed, we can say, actually, sort of forget that for the time being, because from an ultimate perspective, none of these things are strictly true. So I think actually the way in for Western audiences is already written into the framework that a lot of Indian teachers have used for millennia. You know, sort of a graduated teaching where you start off with approximations, and then the more understanding that is gained, you sort of whittle it down and get to a more precise conception. Or that's what we try to do.
Sort of like how in early days in our schools we learned that sun rises from east, sets in west, and then as we mature, we get to know that we are only revolving around sun.
Exactly. So you take they call it a very popular term in Indian philosophy, sublation, where you take elementary knowledge and that is sublated with knowledge that is superior to it. So it's okay for now. At the next step, you'll sublate that with superior knowledge, then superior knowledge, then superior knowledge. And, of course, the end product for the Indian religious traditions would be liberation, ultimately.
I mean, talking about liberation, like, this is just my observation. I'm less than a year into philosophy as academics, or even as a subject in terms of my exposure. But in West, when we try to explain anything in short, it sometimes has liberation as a part of its main summary, and sometimes not. But when we talk about Indian philosophy, liberation is the core essence, while understanding any department or any section of Indian philosophy. So, like, what is your take of this liberation as an idea? Because now you've also started digging into some Western thoughts of idea of salvation or freedom.
Yeah, it's funny because I was brought up Catholic, so for me as a child at church and in church schools, the idea of liberation and salvation, you know, what they call soteriology, is always there or thereabouts. But it's perhaps not as obvious how it's linked to the theology and the philosophy that people are doing sort of underneath. It's really interesting. I think actually there's a lot of similarities. Some differences, but a lot of similarities between some aspects of sort of Western Christian thought and some aspects of all of the Indian religious traditions. So for me, I've been doing a lot of digging, you alluded to it before, I've been doing a lot of digging lately into sort of orthodoxy. And I'm mainly interested in that because they conceive of divinity and of liberation in God's grace slightly different to the Catholic background that I was brought up in. Their idea of liberation, I think, and salvation is really close to some of the dualist and qualified non-dualist schools in Hinduism. And the idea there is that, you know, to briefly summarise it and maybe not do it total justice, if you live a life of contemplation, prayer, purity, fulfilling your religious duty, then you will earn God's grace, and then salvation is a kind of elevation into God's divinity, where you're not the same as God, but you partake in the divinity as a lesser being. You can read about this with people like Maximus the Confessor and St. John of Damascus. You know, there's a long history of it in Eastern Orthodoxy. That sounds to me incredibly similar to something like Vaishnavism or Vishishtadvaita, where, you know, you can be elevated into divinity by grace, provided you live the right way. And it's almost like you earn that by being contemplative, by fulfilling your duties, your dharma, by doing the right thing, you know, by being pure. You earn this grace, you're elevated to divinity, even though your essence is kind of always different to the essence of God. You're nevertheless invited into the blissful sphere, so to speak. So on that sense, there's a similarity. But I think also if you asked most Christians about that, they'd kind of be, what? That doesn't sound very familiar to me. So there are some differences too. And the way you get to that point as well, I think the difference for a lot of people is sort of in the living as directed to by the Bible, as directed to by the priest. That's one thing. Hindu law, the Shastras dictate that you live a certain way to achieve certain ends. That's fine. But then somebody like Shankara comes along, or somebody like the Buddha comes along and kind of says, well, God's grace, personhood, elevated, no, we don't think so. Shankara in particular, no. Speaking about a personal God, we don't want that, actually. We are all divine. Our essence is divine. And it's just that we're confused about that. So this confusion separates us from what we truly are. And the way to get past that, then, is knowledge. But not knowledge in a simple term, not like reading a few books and knowing a lot about the football, knowing a lot about geography or something. It's spiritual knowledge of a certain type. And the end result would be spiritual practice, spiritual knowledge, and eventually a type of gnosis, so in a spiritual communion where you become what you already were, what you always are. And the other thing, I think, the big difference with a take like that, as opposed to the Christian takes, is that it means that you are God already. There's no separation between you and divinity. You are that divinity in microcosmic form, somehow separated from itself through ignorance, avidya, and that's defeatable. You can do it on your own. If you have the help of a guru, that's great. But in principle, you can do this on your own. You don't need church, you don't need priests, you don't need anything really except to follow this way of living and meditate this way and figure this out. That, I think, doesn't have an immediate analogue in a lot of Western thought. And when it does crop up, these people are condemned as heretics.
Right.
So someone like Meister Eckhart kind of made the same point, and he thought we can be part of the Godhead and we can enjoy a mystical communion with him, and not him specifically, but his writings were condemned as heresies. That's kind of changing recently. Actually, there's a lot more.
Okay.
There's a lot more sympathy to him in the Catholic Church. But I still think he would want to say he was a Christian. He was a Dominican friar. If he was here and you asked him, "Do you think your method is the same as Shankara's?" I think he'd say no, because he'd want to uphold the broad theology of Christianity, and he'd still want to endorse Christ the Saviour, Christ the Son of God, even though he thinks, well, the Godhead is there and we can communicate with it directly. So similarities, but quite sharp differences as well. I think the one thread, I was thinking about this last night, the one thread I think runs through all of them is that to varying degrees knowledge is really important. Spiritual knowledge is super important, and maybe this isn't surprising. Religious traditions aim at liberation in one form or another. You have to know how to get there to do that. But the paths to me seem, for as many differences as there are certainly as many similarities, I think. And the significance of knowledge and recognising that knowledge, realisation, rather than just... so when they say, like, Christ was the living word, and they say the Buddha was the living Dharma, and I think that sort of knowledge, living what you know, is crucial to pretty much all religious traditions who seek some sort of soteriological end. So that for me is really interesting. Maybe not for other people. I think it's obvious.
No, it is indeed interesting. And like you mentioned Shankar and Buddha, like there's a huge even though they both denied the existence of personal God, they both wanted that people should grow spiritually.
Absolutely.
through knowledge, and every individual has capacity to grow spiritually without having a personal God or giving the human attributes to God or divine.
Yes.
But then there's also especially in mainland India back in the days, there were huge clash and ideation of Buddhism and Advaita, specifically what Shankar said.
Yeah.
Like, how do you see those two?
It's funny because it's often said that Shankara sort of saw off Buddhism in India, right, and reclaimed it for sort of the Hindu religion. There's a lot of debate about that, and I don't really have a strong opinion about that. But the other debate is, was Shankara a proto-Buddhist or a crypto-Buddhist? So was he sort of repackaging Buddhist ideas for his contemporary Hindu audience? I don't know about that. I mean, this is something I think about a lot. There's a lot of similarity. We have to admit there's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of similarities in the process, in the terminology used. Shankara even used the traditionally Buddhist conception of two levels of truth, relative and ultimate. So he borrowed a lot. And Gaudapada, Shankara's guru as well, similarly borrowed a lot. But I think the differences are sort of sharp enough to say that they are different disciplines aiming at maybe different conceptions of what, liberation is. The Buddha never actually said that liberation involves sort of absorption into the cosmic soul or into the Brahman. He said that it was just release from rebirth. Now, there's tons of different interpretations of what that means. Even in Buddhist traditions themselves, they disagree on exactly how this works. That's fine. But Shankara never ever countenanced that. He was always clear that liberation consists in return to the Brahman. And that is the only way, and if that's the only way, we should tell people that that's the only way. So I think maybe if we had them in a room, they might agree on the method, but I think they disagree about where the end is. At least that's my impression of it. But yeah, it's interesting to me how many similarities there are. The method is in some ways almost identical, but the talk about where we end up is quite different. For the Buddha, end of samsara, doesn't elaborate on that. What does that mean? Doesn't really go any further. Shankara, the end of rebirth, is absorption into the Brahman, realising that you are the Brahman, you're returning back to yourself, almost.
Right, interesting. And like, other than Buddhism, because we know you've done a lot of work in Buddhism, which other school or tradition of Indian philosophy you find most interesting?
Oh, that's a great question. I really love Advaita because of what we've just been talking about, and the similarities and the differences, and the back and forth, the debate, between the two traditions. I really like Jainism.
Interesting.
And I'm working on things at the minute. It's not quite there yet, but Jainism also uses truth in strange ways and seems to hint at. It doesn't explicitly say this, or at least that I've come across yet, but it seems to hint at least two levels of truth in the same way that Advaita does, that Buddhism does. And I'm really interested in that because I think this could be a kind of a pan-Indian concept at this point, where there's not one universal truth, or there is one universal truth, but there's also levels of that, relative truths that we can understand at certain points that are removed, we understand a bit more removed. And this is a difference, I think, to a lot of other religious traditions, which would not talk about truth is truth. You can't have two of them, or no more. Right. So I'm really interested in that at the moment. That's my sort of on the back burner research thing for Indian philosophy at the minute.
Interesting. And because even in India, Jainism has sort of delved in so beautifully in terms of the cultural structure.
Yeah.
Like it's easy to identify sort of a Hindu or a Buddhist, but it's very hard for you to identify just by observing an individual that are they Jain or are they Hindus. Right. So they've dwelled into the culture so beautifully that to me, when I was not exposed to these understanding of schools, I thought that maybe Jainism was a part of Hindu tradition at a young age. But later, when I got to know it, I understood it. But like they've dwelled in so beautifully.
This is actually a common thing I find. There's an argument made in the Indian Constitution that says that something like all Indian religions originating on the Indian subcontinent are Hindu in some form, including Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, and I don't know about that. But you are right. There's a lot culturally, intellectually, philosophically that's shared across all the traditions, and the fact that people can just slot in culturally, they live life now. I think that is testament to this shared background, shared understanding, shared heritage. Right. And again, it sounds like you're downplaying these traditions to say little tweaks. Little tweaks can be significant. A small tweak at the bottom can lead to a big deviation at the top. And I think that's a lot of what happens with Indian religious traditions. They disagree on a small thing at the bottom, and it leads to big deviations, 1,000 years later. Probably the same with Christianity. Maybe less so. Well, actually, Islam has two major sects which disagree fundamentally on certain theological positions. So, I think that's probably the same for a lot of religions that originate from the same sort of geographical locations.
Right.
Owing to the shared cultural heritage and the people mix.
Yeah.
You just live alongside one another, and the ideas are there, but they're different.
Right. That's interesting. Because, I mean, when I actually got a bit of understanding of, okay, there are different schools, and every school has their own particular understanding of how to lead life, what are their thoughts, how they look at things, and then when I look back in terms of how I engaged with these ideas, it does not seem like that I was fixated into just one particular mindset, even though I come from a Hindu background, which is mostly, especially after independence, it was mostly neo-Vedantic, which is more Advaitic to what Shankar proposed in the earlier days. But still, I would see a lot of mix, because when we see the term tantric, it is usually associated with non-Vedic, but the way it is mixed into a culture and in our regular understanding, it seems that this is also a different way to the same thing, and it is also considered under the same umbrella of Hinduism, and we also see, I mean, that's really sort of interesting in terms of just like how we say Europe in general, but you cannot define Europe with just one or two countries.
Yeah, exactly. And the key thing, I think, with any religious or philosophical tradition is they're not monolithic. They're living, breathing things. And I always say to my students, like, the Buddhism that we read about and the Buddhist philosophy that we talk about, the Hindu philosophy too, that's one thing. But it's really hard to say that is Hinduism, because actually Hinduism is in the people that practice it. Buddhism is in the communities that practice it, and what they do is what Buddhism is, what Hinduism is, what Christianity is. And so, I think the stuff about Tantra is really interesting, because later teachings, hidden, secret teachings, yes, maybe not outlaid explicitly in the Vedas or in the Upanishads or in the Nikayas for Buddhists. I don't think that's a problem. I think you've got learned people versed in these backgrounds who live this, do this, and they've got a contribution to make on a teaching that then would be, thought of as tantric. But that doesn't mean that teaching is any less valuable, and it's being put forth by somebody from that tradition, who lives that tradition, who breathes is that tradition. They've got things to say, and we build on that. And I think that's normal, or should be. So for me, I know people do get hung up on, like, is this real Buddhism, or is this real Hinduism? And I think when I was maybe in my early 20s, just starting out, I was prone to that as well. but experience has taught me that actually there's a lot of different perspectives, and that's all right.
Yeah. So, like, what's your take on the dualist and non-dualist idea in Hinduism? Because I'm personally more interested in the dualist side, Sankhya.
Yeah.
But like as you said, you're more interested in non-dualist side.
Or at least that's where my work has been. Yeah. Okay. It's a good question, and it's hard for me to answer in some ways, because I think if I had to choose between the two, I just wouldn't. If you'd say to me, which one do you think is correct, I would probably say I don't know.
Agreed.
But there's a reason for that too, and like I'm really comfortable with what some interpretations of Nagarjuna would say. His quietism on these questions, where he's like, I don't need to answer ontological questions. That's for other people. Actually, what we're trying to deal with is how to live better. And traditionally that's been my focus with philosophy. It's not so much, I know, do we want to get to what the truth of the universe is? I understand the draw to that, and there's whole traditions built on it. That's fine. Western metaphysics, do we know what an object is? Things I'm not interested in that at all. For me, how can this help us live better? How can it make us a bit happier, a bit more resilient even? So the metaphysical stuff for me is kind of interested in an intellectual way. But then I think, does it, in terms of how I lived my life, would one or the other being true make a huge difference? And I'm not sure that it would. So if we think about Sankhya as an example, realising that we are a total realisation, like a mystical realisation, that we are the Purusha and not the Prakriti, the matter, the corrupted matter that's over there, that's sufficient for liberation. Okay, great. That seems reasonable to me. Advaita, we don't see that distinction, but knowledge that we are this also leads to liberation. Think, okay, so you agree that knowledge that you are ultimately better than this takes you to a point of liberation. What you disagree with is exactly where that divorce is. So for Sankhya, get away from this idea that we're involved in the material world. We want to push that to one side. Whereas Shankara would say, well, everything is part of the Brahman, and we just don't think about it in the right way. So to get to the end point, I think they're after the same thing. And it's just there's a little distinction at the bottom, like I said, at the bottom, in how they're conceiving of the world around them that leads to a divergence. I respect that, but I don't think I would pick between them. I think ultimately they'd be both aiming at a similar thing, which is liberation. And I think actually, whether we make that distinction between Prakriti and matter being corrupted and we should draw ourselves away from it or not, might not make that big a difference. I know that's a controversial thing to say. But for me, I think I wouldn't be concerned with that distinction. I would just push the other way. Like, the knowledge of what we are is more important than thinking about it. Is there a distinction between me, you, the earth, the universe? At the same time, I also think thinking that we are the same as me, you, the universe leads to similar sorts of trappings. So in this sense, I am quite Nagarjunayan. It's like, I don't worry about that.
Interesting, because I'm coming from physics background, so metaphysics is one of the most interesting thing. Coming from a scientific background, is like,
totally get that. Yeah.
What do you mean? Like, like, if you say this, then how do we understand the fundamentals of things?
Yeah.
And because
how does it translate into what we know
reality?
about the universe?
Yeah, exactly. And because, like, I'm writing an essay about understanding the similarities of what Sankhya says in terms of interactionism. Is like when Sankhya says that the passive observer is enough to create to evolve matter, so that we get different results out of it, different fruits out of it. So like even in one of the experiment in physics called Young's double slit experiment, we usually see light passing through two slits as wave, but when we put a detector near the slits, it suddenly starts behaving as particle.
Yeah, like because it's being watched, it behaves differently because you're interacting with it.
It is not directly interacting with it.
That's just the
just the presence of a passive observer.
Yeah,
it makes a huge difference in how matter changes
and the outcome in the world.
Yeah,
that's it. Yeah, it's a nice point. And actually, yeah, I can see where you're doing this, and then because that would change how we need to conceive of how we act in the world. It might even change what we conceive of as liberation, to be honest. Because if the way we act forms, I think in a lot of ways, certainly in social ways it does, but if in physical ways what we do informs the laws of the universe, the way things work for us, then it would need kind of a universal rethink.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe they were onto something. 2,000 years ago, thinking about this stuff.
Maybe.
And this is good because I think there's a danger sometimes, and you might have experienced this when I was a graduate student, and I would tell people I was specialising in Indian philosophy. It was kind of, kind of dead traditions. What does that have to offer? What's that got to say about the world we live in now? Actually, maybe it does have something fundamental. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, so like you just said when you graduated and there was this response from people. So like, do you think Indian philosophy in West is underrepresented or misrepresented to a degree?
Yes, to both, but I will preface that by saying it's getting better. The situation now is tons better than it was in sort of 2012, 2013 when I got into it. Misrepresented in some ways that annoy me is that a lot more philosophers than you'd think still see this as religious woo, and they don't think it's real philosophy. And that really annoys me, because if you look at some of this stuff with even the slightest opening of your mind, there's been serious work done in epistemology, metaphysics, for millennia, serious work. Yes, by religious people, but so what? That doesn't really matter if the philosophy is good and the arguments are strong. I don't care if my surgeon is a Christian or a Muslim if he can fix what's going on with my knee. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't think that we should dismiss this stuff just because, religious philosophy. Actually, religious philosophy has lots of valuable things to say. And a lot of the time you can pick out, but even if you're so dead set on removing the religion from it, you can. And you can pick out some really valuable things. And one thing that sticks to mind with me, particularly about this, is when I was writing my PhD thesis, I spent a lot of time talking about the nature of epistemological knowledge. The pramanas in the Indian traditions, are pramanas ultimately significant? Do they give an ultimate answer to the way the world is? You don't need to be religious to think about that question. Are they relative or are they final analysis? I think that's a question you can ask entirely away from religion. And yet the major work done in this in India was by religious people for 2,000 years, 3,000 years. You don't need to be a Buddhist monk to take the position of Nagarjuna and the Madhyamikas that we don't think that human knowledge can answer ultimate foundational questions. And we don't think that anything gives a final analysis, a correct final analysis, and perhaps seeking that is a flawed project. You don't need to be religious to hold that opinion. The same way that you don't need to be religious to hold the converse opinion that actually we can get ultimate final analysis answers, and we should pursue that, and there are ways that are conducive to getting these answers. So in terms of misrepresentation, that's the big one for me, and it really annoys me that it's quite prevalent. If it's not Greek in origin, then some philosophers and some philosophy departments don't see it as worthwhile, and I think that's a mistake. Underrepresented, certainly, everywhere, I think, but again, it's getting better. The community of sort of young people interested in Indian philosophy graduating from PhD programs and stuff is much, much healthier now than 10, 20 years ago. Liverpool are spoilt a little bit in that they've had Chris here for so long, and not only is he a specialist in the Indian traditions, but he runs courses, full courses on the Indian traditions, because my experience elsewhere has been that when students do encounter Buddhism, Hinduism, rare that they might encounter Jainism, rarer still that they encounter something like Sikhism and the philosophy there.
Yeah.
It's as part of maybe 2 weeks in a broader course. You know, they'll get a non-specialist, which is fine, teaching them for 2 lectures and 2 seminars. And that's enough to kind of whet the appetite and get you interested, but it's not a deep dive. And places like this that facilitate the deep dive over a substantial course, substantial assessments, I think is still quite rare. And that is a shame too. Where I am in Manchester, the philosophy department doesn't do any Indian stuff. The religious studies department kind of does, but not to the degree that I was used to. When I was taught here and when I worked here, I taught at Liverpool Hope, and we did full year courses in Indian traditions, you know, both semesters. 1 semester fully Buddhism, 1 semester fully Hinduism. Later on, we were doing Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism. And I think something like that is actually, it's really important. And students respond to it. Students want to know this stuff. It's interesting to them.
It is.
So I think, yeah, misrepresented in some ways, underrepresented, definitely. But I have hope. It is getting better.
Indeed, it is, because even in India, philosophy is a subject, and a lot of subjects were not looked up to for a certain period of time. But now, when also there's an upsurge in spirituality on a global scale, there's still the interest in religious studies and philosophies have also seen increase in number of students being interested and
it's
and
funny,
being
isn't
engaged.
it? You think there's a research. It's true, and we see it across the board, I think. So for me, there's something lacking in our modern social life that people think these questions might be able to answer, or these religious traditions might be able to answer. And that's really interesting for me, because I think sometimes, like, especially in the West, we see church attendance has dropped right off. I was the same. By the time I was 14, 15, I wasn't going to church. I was still at church schools, but I didn't go, wasn't active. And then it was much later on, by the time I was in my 20s, when I was sort of like, okay, I don't do that anymore, but perhaps there are some sort of satisfying philosophical or theological reasons, you know, some good arguments, something I can get to grips with. And I think we're seeing that now across. There's a big thing at the moment, I was reading the other day, conversion, especially in the US, to not the Catholic Church, but to the Orthodox Church. It's up by incredible numbers, really incredible numbers. And why is that? So there's a dissatisfaction somewhere, and people suspect maybe they can get the answer, and they're going looking for it. And I think, you know, I'm not saying everybody needs to be sort of super religious or whatever, and people can make their own choices, of course, but it's worthwhile us discussing this stuff, and it's worth us looking at it and studying it and taking it apart. And I think we owe it to ourselves and to society to interrogate these questions and to interrogate these possible answers. Like I was saying before, wherever they come from, just because an answer is offered by a religious tradition doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. And it doesn't even necessarily mean it has to be a religious answer. Often there's ways to whittle it down and say, well, actually, if you don't buy into this notion of God, that's all right, because this principle here you can still work with. And I think maybe this is what people are looking for, and we should capitalise on that. Right.
So what do you understand by the term spirituality in general?
Well, there's two aspects to it as I see it. My experience with people who say they're interested in spirituality is twofold. It's people who are sort of really interested and buy books and go to meet teachers and spiritual teachers and talk to them and learn and things like this. And then there's the other side, which is sort of like, I don't want to sound dismissive, but, you know, crystals, new age, self-help stuff. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I think there's a distinction between the two that is quite strong. And people seeking out spiritual answers from different traditions, I think, goes to show what we were discussing earlier on. They suspect that some of these answers are universal, and that somebody in India might have figured this out, whereas their church hadn't quite got it, or the answer might be different for them. They might want something else out of life, and that speaks more strongly to them. Because I think this is often the case too. Philosophers often want to get down to the nitty-gritty, figuring out, let's say, the fundamentals of consciousness. What is it? How can we explain it? How does it operate? And that's great. That's a noble cause. Plenty of people do it. Fantastic. In tandem with scientists. Great. But I think actually for a normal person, what they're more concerned about is how to deal with consciousness, not what it is. How to deal with it, and how to sort of deal with the world around them, to manipulate things so that it's better for them, to experience the world better, to experience consciousness in a nicer way. And for me, I think that's what people who are into spirituality are sort of chasing. They want to experience things in a different way, in a better way, to answer some sort of deep-seated question that they've got. And I think many of them probably aren't too concerned about what the fundamental nature of consciousness is, as much as they are concerned with how can I use these ideas to make my life a bit nicer. And that's really where my interest is in philosophy, really, sort of that intersection between, yes, some metaphysics, ethics, definitely, and a sort of a pragmatic approach to how can we bring these together to give ourselves the tools to make our life better than it was.
Right. So, but like, I've also seen that, especially in the West, because there's a lot of pressure for an individual, especially when they turn 18, to self-sustain themselves, monetary, and also because there's deteriorating culture of family now, because like most of the time people meet with the family only during Christmas or during breaks. Other than that, there's no culture of family, and even if they want to live in the same city, they live in separate houses. And to me, I was aware of it before I came here, but when I came here and when I saw it,
still a shock.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that just having those human relations intact, even though they are being, I mean everything has their own pros and cons. I completely understand.
Of course.
Like you might not always be comfortable with people in your family, because there might be some clashes. And you will also not be always happy when you live alone all by yourself. So I think, I mean, this distinction of I mean, what should I say? This separation of people from family and human connection. I think then that makes them more unsatisfied, and they want to be more. They want to engage more into self-help, community, or spirituality.
Absolutely agree.
And I think that has now, because after COVID, it is usually been understood that there's a pandemic of mental health coming around, and we can see that in terms of how many number of cases we were seeing. So from my perspective, if there's a way where we can satisfy an individual with more of with better engagement in philosophy, I think then that will also help in developing a more ethical structure in society.
Yes. I was thinking, this is exactly what I was thinking about yesterday, actually. This is the other thing that religious traditions of any culture give: community, and a really strong sense of it, because you're all doing the same thing, you all want the same thing. And especially what you're saying about sort of separation of families is, I think that's nailed on, actually. And that's part of the problem, for sure. It is weirdly individualistic in the UK now. This idea of like sort of just doing things for yourself and not being concerned with other people really bothers me. And I think actually culturally it should bother us. And we've never been like this really before. There's always been a strong sense of community and shared endeavours, shared suffering. And actually, I always spin everything back to the Buddhist stuff, but in a lot of ways, especially in the Mahayana schools, there's a shared sense of liberation. And what was worrying about, for some thinkers, about sort of early forms of Buddhism was that a lot of the Theravada schools encourage an individualistic focus on liberation. What Isaiah Berlin called the retreat to the inner citadel. And the concern with that is, if you are solely focused on, I'm going to focus on me and what I can do, it leaves all sorts of doors open for bad things to happen in society. You become less concerned with what's going on to the communities around you, more concerned with, well, if I focus on me, I'll be okay. And I think this is a legitimate concern. Historically, we've seen it happen in Buddhist countries especially, where large communities of monastics keep themselves to themselves because, hey, I'm focusing on nirvana, I'm not getting involved in this. And then you have awful regimes coming around them. The Mahayana movement to push back against that was the sort of the bodhisattva ideal. So the bodhisattva is a person who's within touching distance of liberation, but puts it off because they feel compelled to help the people around them. And, I'm not saying it's a magic cure, but I like the idea, and I think actually it should be a fundamental human idea that we help the people around us, and that my suffering is your suffering is my suffering. Bad things happening in society is bad for us all, not just for you, or not just for me. And we should have a sort of coherent sense of pushing back against that together. And I think you are right when people go to seek out these spiritual communities. I think this is part of it. They feel disconnected. They feel like, well, nobody helps me with my problems and, what's going on. And they can find that when they go to join a sangha or they go to an ashram, or something. Even if they join a church, they will find that sort of help. So for me, it's a fundamental human need, and for whatever reason, we're just neglecting it. Over the past 50 years, and for sure over the past 5 years since COVID, for sure. I see the effects of this every day, because I deal with young undergraduate students, 18-year-olds, and we see the effect that this isolation, and it's not good. So I think we do need to get back to that, and I think you are spot on when you say, is this why people are seeking out more spiritual pursuits in groups of like-minded individuals? I think, yeah, that's definitely part of it.
Yeah.
A big part of it, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you so much for giving us the time. Like at the end of do you have any questions for me?
I don't know. I think I've really enjoyed this, so thank you. It's nice to come and talk about this stuff. I don't get so much chance to do it anymore, so it's been really good.
Yeah, we'll be having much more conversations about Indian philosophy
awesome.
in the future.
Yes, that'll suit me just fine.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.